All right, so what we're talking today about is getting your bow to the ultimate level of forgiveness, all right? In my opinion, that's the most important thing about a hunting bow is you want it forgiving, which ultimately tuning, achieving forgiveness, it's kind of the same thing. I'm no professional archer, but I have got to spend a lot of time around a lot of professional archers and guys that are really, really a lot smarter at this stuff than me. So I just wanted to kind of bridge the gap of information between some of this deep dive target archery stuff and really fast track you to getting your bow to where it's as forgiving as possible for hunting, because that's part of deer hunting strategy is what we're all about, and it makes a world of difference. So we're going to kind of break it down into 5 steps. I did this really quick, so I might rethink these, but step 1 would be to plan your setup with Archer's Advantage. All right, and now that one, basically, it's spine charts and stuff are not really like a one size fits all. You might want a certain FOC, and you might want a certain broadhead. So the variable that you could play with might be the nock end of your arrow, so your nock weight, your vanes, different brands, wraps, So it's kind of like you have to figure out the things that you want and that you don't want to sacrifice, and then move other things around to get your spine correct. And I'll show you that right now. And basically, this is my archery setup here, my archery shop. It looks kind of fancy, but I would highly recommend everybody having a bow press, because the bow press is going to allow you to work on your own bow. And even if your bow is perfectly tuned when it leaves the archery shop, a lot of people, myself included for years and stuff, you go to the archery shop, you get your stuff tuned, hopefully it's tuned well, and then stuff changes and you really don't even ever notice it because you can't check your timing, you can't do things like that. So I would highly recommend, these things aren't crazy expensive. I would buy a less dollar bow and put one of these in my budget before I'd buy the most expensive bow in the world and not have one of these. That important. A vise is kind of a simple device, and then a poundage scale. This particular bow press has a draw board, and that draw board allows you to draw that bow back in so you can check the timing and the weight and stuff. So I would recommend having your own little setup and learn this stuff. There's so many good videos on YouTube. But even if you're going to go to an archery shop to have your stuff set up, I would highly recommend using Archer's Advantage to plan your setup ahead of time. And that way you can go in there with some knowledge and just make sure that the arrows you're getting are the right spine, and you can kind of show them the roadmap to your plan. Because unfortunately I've seen a lot of people's bows, including mine, my friends and stuff, where they go to an archery shop and then the most basic thing like the spine of the arrow is not right, and therefore the bow will never tune and never achieve forgiveness, which ultimately is going to up your odds the most of making good shots in the woods. And forgiveness is a kind of a big topic, but basically what it is your arrow is just flying perfect and it's flexing perfect, the spine, the stiffness of the arrow, and it's just flying perfect. And so if you make a little bit of a mistake, you tweak your wrist or something, and when you're practicing, a lot of stuff is very consistent, but when you're in the woods hunting and you're in a weird situation, you are not holding the bow the same way, you're not anchoring the bow the same way, you're not gripping the bow the same way, there's wind, there's all these things. So when your arrow's coming out of there and it's not forgiving and it kicks when it comes out and you're just relying on your fletchings to straighten it out, when it doesn't come out of the bow perfect, if the bow was originally forgiving or originally set up correctly, when you do make those minor errors, it's going to fly a heck of a lot better than an untuned bow that then is exaggerated by these variables in the wood. So that was kind of a little bit of a deep dive. I'm trying not to do that, but we want to get the bow forgiving. So the first step would be to plan it with Archer's Advantage. So I'll kind of show you that. All right, so everybody's gonna have an idea of what broadheads they wanna shoot or whatever, you know, and some things are gonna be harder set on than others. Maybe you're more hard set on your broadhead setup than your vanes, or more hard set on your FOC than your vanes or whatever. So you're gonna get in here to Archer's Advantage. First thing you're gonna do is click up on setup, and there's a lot of intricate stuff in here, but really for what we're trying to show you to do, you only need to use 2 tabs, which is setup and shaft selector. So you're gonna go to setup. It's gonna be in arrow configuration, and first you're gonna add a new setup, so name it your bow or whatever. So you're gonna be in shaft details. This is Toby's Phase 4. So we use Victory Rip TKOs. We put in 350 spine, arrow length of 27.5. And that's all basically what we think that it's gonna need to be, right? All right, and then we're gonna go to point weight, 100 grain broadhead, and then I have 60 for the point weight adapter, and that's because he's got a 50 grain HIT brass hidden insert with a 10 grain iron will titanium collar. So you got 60 grains. We're gonna go to knock detail. He's got AAE IP5s, which weigh 8.4. And you can put generic in there and just weigh this stuff too. So you could just weigh your knock. Fletch details, well, tack vanes, the driver 2.75s and 3 of them, and then arrow wrap. Basically, we use the 1 stringer reflective ones, 4 inches, but I know they weigh 7 grains, so I just chose a wrap that weighed 7 grains. Sight configuration tab is basically for if you're printing sight tapes, and then so you don't need to really worry about that for this, what we're talking about today. And then bow configuration, you basically select bow from list. I selected Phase 4 because that's what his bow is. I put in the weight, and auto put in the brace height, IBO speed and all that stuff. And then I put in his draw length. And then an important thing to do here is to actually shoot the bow through a chronograph, and then if you can, and put the arrow speed in there, even if it's not the exact arrow, because you're probably going to be buying arrows, just shoot one that's similar and to get an arrow speed, because it's going to be pretty close to the same with different arrows right out of the bow, close enough for this. So once we have all the info in here, what we do is go back to shaft selector. That's kind of like the main page. And in this situation, it shows that black bar perfectly in the optimum spine. And that's because I've already fooled around with all this. But like if I had put on like a normal fletching, not the tacks that were heavier, his FOC, which it shows right here is 14.5, would have been like maybe 16, or it would have been less. But the point is, everything is kind of balanced for his setup. He wanted 60 pounds, he wanted a 100 grain broadhead, and so from there, if your spine is not showing correctly on this chart, you can adjust your arrow length, and you can do it right on this page. So like right now it's 27.5. If I put in 29, you're gonna see the spine get too weak. The longer the arrow is, the weaker it gets, the shorter it is, the stiffer it gets. And you can change spine, everything changes the spine on the arrow. Some things change it more than others. So anyway, you keep the things that you are dead set on, like the broadhead, you know, broadhead weight. If you want to shoot tack vanes or whatever, you keep the things that are definites, and you start adjusting the things that you can live with, like arrow length and wraps and fletching weights and lighted versus not light. Start messing with everything until you've got the setup that you want configured. Okay, and now this is not the end all be all. It's not perfect, but it is gonna get you the right spined arrow, and it's gonna get you in control of your arrow destiny. So when you go to the bow shop, you can say, you know, these are the arrows I want. This is kind of what I'm building, and then it all makes sense to them too. So that is step 1, is to plan your setup. All right. Step 2 is to check the specs on the bow, the factory specs. So basically you would just Google the factory specs on your bow. And the important ones are gonna be your axle to axle. So they'll usually say, like this bow, the axle is the pin that goes through there. So this bow, the axle to axle, you know, looks like it's probably 33 inches. And it'll usually say 33 plus or minus an eighth. So as long as it's within an eighth of that, it's within spec. Then the other big, spec is going to be your brace height, which is from the palm of your grip up. This one's 6.5, and that's probably going to be within the specs, or the plus or minus eighth of an inch. Okay, and what happens is if the strings stretch over time, the axle might get bigger, and when it gets bigger, they pull down, which shrinks your brace height. So anyway, you just want to, and that gets a little intricate, which we're not going to do today, on how to get that back into spec, but you're basically, twisting up these two cables, which is tightening it, bringing it together, bringing those cams a little higher to get your brace height back together. So dumbing it down, you're checking the specs of your bow, so you know you've got a good starting point, and then you're going to check the cam timing of every bow is different. Some of the older ones are different, but a lot of these newer bows and stuff, it's critical that your cam timing is correct, and that's just making sure that both of your cams are coming around at exactly the same time, and the string stops are touching the cables at exactly the same time. And if not, one cam's wanting to go faster than another, and you'll get wild tears. You'll never get forgiveness like that. So those are the three big things in step 2: is checking the specs, axle, and brace height. And in general, if your specs are right, your peak draw weight will be right too. But if your strings are stretched and your axle's long and your brace is short, the max you might get out of your bow for draw weight might be less than what your bow originally was. So check the specs, so you're starting from square one, and check the timing so that basically the bow is mechanically set up right. Show you a couple things in this clip here really quick. This is a draw board. You always want a knock in there, but this is also how you put your scale in there to check the weight. So this comes around, and these stops right here, you'll see them, that little stop right there. When that touches that string, you want that and the bottom cam touching at exactly the same time. And that's the timing. Pretty simple. Step 3 is going to be to set the center shot to factory specs. So basically, and this changes, but a lot of these newer bows are really pretty, I think, accurate to this. So like if the bow says 13/16 is the factory spec, what you'll do is you'll put the arrow in there, and then you'll take a tape measure, and you will measure from the riser out to the center of the arrow, and it'll be whatever the manufacturer says the center shot should be. Because really, if they're saying it's supposed to be in a certain spot, it probably should be in the spot. So if the bow tunes way in or something, well then there's probably something else maybe more intricate than you can do, but it tells you there's a problem. You might have to, like in the Matthews, they have this awesome top hat system, which are shims, and you might just have to shim the whole entire cam and string system over, to bring a good tune, a good paper tear into the correct center shot location, rather than trying to get bring the center shot out to where it's not really supposed to be anyway. So again, dumbing that down, just look at what the manufacturer says the bow should have as a center shot, and have that be your starting point. All right, step 4, paper tune. We all know what paper tuning is. Print you out a paper tuning chart, because it's impossible to remember that information. I've tried for 15 years. It just doesn't happen. So get you this printed out so you got it. And basically what we're going to do is shoot the bow through paper and see how that arrow is acting in the air. And again, it's just supposed to, it's supposed to be just flexing as it goes through the air, nice and perfect, as it comes off of the bow. It's not supposed to come out of the bow and go whap and then flap, so that's what we're looking for. So go down here to the paper. We'll walk through the stage left, all the old school music stuff. And we'll look at a paper full of these guys. You can see there's some crazy stuff in there, but you know, basically, let's find a good one. If I can remember correctly, well, anyway, there's an array of paper tears here, but on a 3-fletch configuration, that is what you're looking for. And probably shooting these from about, you know, 9 steps back or so. I think there's a lot of argument and discussion on how far to shoot it, but really if you go back 9 steps or so, 7, 9 steps and shoot it, you're gonna know pretty quick what's going on. I'm not gonna get too crazy into the tears, but because you got charts to tell you that, but you'll move your rest around and you'll maybe move it up and down, side to side, and hopefully you can get a nice, perfect, clean bullet hole paper tear. Tons of videos online to talk about that. Maybe we'll make another one later if you guys like the deer hunter talking about archery stuff. So shoot that thing through paper and we get her really close. That's generally, if you're lucky and you go to a good archery shop, that's generally where they get you to. But in my opinion, for hunting, when we're trying to achieve forgiveness, I always fletch up, and that brings us to our last, number 5, bear shaft tune. I always leave one of my arrows unfletched, and this is really awesome because if you're traveling, hunting, or whatever, and your bow something seems a little off or whatever, you can check this, and you don't need the paper and all that jazz. You can kind of recheck your tune. So what we're going to do is shoot an arrow that is fletched and an arrow that is bare shafted, and you just want them to hit together down there, you know, 20 yards. You really want them to just, in a perfect world, be right next to each other and be kind of lined up with each other. And what you'll see is even with a perfect looking bullet hole, you know, your bear shaft might be higher, your bear shaft might be lower, it might be to the side. And generally when it's not really close to this arrow, you're going to see it kind of kicked into the target as well. Because what's happening is it's really not coming off as perfect as that bullet hole might have shown. And your fletchings is grabbing a hold of it and straightening it out, and it's kind of an illusion. There is no illusion with this bear shaft. So when it's coming out of the bow and hitting the same spot as this, your bow is really, really tuned and shooting them good. And until you get the bow doing that, it's just not at its most forgiving state it can be in. And as hunters, we really need to get to that most forgiving place, because that's when everything gets easier. That's when your mistakes get a little bit less exaggerated in the field. And so that's my process to it. All right, so bear shaft and fletch shaft, right together, very similar angles, and that's what you want. Once your bow is doing that, I mean, I wouldn't even pay attention to the paper, nothing. I mean, because if it's doing that, it is forgiving. All right, so that's kind of my 5-step process to getting my bow perfectly tuned and ultimately as forgiving as it can be. You know, unfortunately, I'd venture to say most bows, maybe 75% or more, are not as forgiving as they can be. And we as deer hunters, we do all this stuff and spend all this time for that moment. And the more stuff we can have perfect and forgiving, the higher odds we have of success. So we all owe it to ourselves to go to these lengths to get our bows perfectly tuned and forgiving, to make us more successful in the woods and more ethical.